Hey everyone, Darwin's God here. Why is the genetic code such powerful evidence for the theory of evolution? Last time I showed you an example from a textbook that made that argument. This time I'll show you the same argument being made in a popular book, and we'll dive a little bit deeper. So here we go. This is a book written by Alan Rogers, a life science professor at the University of Utah. It's entitled The Evidence for Evolution, and it was written in 2011. What better place to find out why the genetic code is such powerful evidence for evolution? So let's have a look. Rogers writes, "We have established that evolution makes small changes, but does it make large ones? Did it make amphibians from fish and mammals from reptiles? Evolutionists think so, but consider another possibility. Perhaps God created many kinds of plants and animals, all the major taxa, and then let them evolve." Okay, well that's the introduction to one of his chapters, and there's problems with this little paragraph right here, but I want to skip down to where he makes the argument for the genetic code. Here he writes, "Different species could have different genetic codes just as easily as different human populations speak different languages, but they don't. Every living thing, from the smallest microorganism to the largest whale, makes proteins using essentially the same arbitrary code. What sense does this make? Unless all these forms of life evolved from a single ancestor." Okay, so here Rogers makes the claim that the genetic code is strong evidence for the theory of evolution. Otherwise, it just makes no sense. You have to have evolution to explain this. This is a very powerful argument. Let's take a deeper look at it. Let's have a look at this first part. Different species could have different genetic codes just as easily as different human populations speak different languages. Is this really true? Now, we saw the same claim made in the textbook we looked at last time, and it makes no scientific sense at all. Species share genetic information amongst themselves. They transfer genetic material between species. When they do that, it helps to have the same genetic code. This sharing of genetic material is called lateral gene transfer or horizontal gene transfer. Here's a paper I picked out of many I could have shown you on horizontal gene transfer. It's a review paper from 2009, a couple of years before Rogers' book, and it talks about the importance of horizontal gene transfer, in this case between microbial eukaryotes. The point is, gene transfer is important. It's been known about for a while, and it contradicts this claim that Rogers makes that different species could have different genetic codes just as easily as different human populations speak different languages. No, I'm afraid it's not that simple. It simply does not work that way. The science contradicts the claim here. Okay, what next now? Let's skip down to where he says the code is arbitrary. He describes the genetic code as an arbitrary code. Well, again, the science contradicts this. Here's a paper we've looked at. This paper is from 1998. The genetic code is 1 in a million. Here's a 2007 paper about multi-level optimization of the genetic code. Multi-level optimization. This is a special code. This is not an arbitrary code. Here's another 2007 paper about how the code supports additional information being coded. This is not an arbitrary code. The science is contradicting what the evolutionists say. Okay, let's move on to the next sentence here. What sense does this make, Rogers asks. In other words, what sense does it make that all the species share the same genetic code? Well, if he's asking what sense does it make, he needs to ask what sense does it make that it could have evolved. Now, we looked at this in detail in previous videos. I'll just quickly review this. There are all kinds of scientific problems with the idea that the code evolved. The code is extremely complicated. It is circular in the sense that you need proteins to make proteins, and the code must have evolved very early. In other words, if evolution is true, the code must have evolved very early in evolutionary history, leaving little time. And of course, since the code did not evolve after that, evolutionists are forced to conclude that it's not evolvable. So somehow it evolved, but it must not be evolvable. We also find that it's a very special code, even though evolutionists figured that it must be an arbitrary code. Again, the science contradicted the theory. And finally, the sophistication of the code forced evolutionists to conclude that gee, the code actually helps evolution. But that was a massive violation of Occam's razor. So all kinds of scientific problems here that Rogers is ignoring when he asks, what sense does it make? Okay, so back to Rogers' argument. Let's break it down step by step so we know exactly what we're dealing with here. So step 1, if God created the species independently, then they would have different genetic codes. 2, the species share a common genetic code. 3, therefore the species were not independently created. 4, therefore they share a common ancestor. And 5, therefore evolution is true. Well, we can say that the argument is valid and that there's a logical flow here, but there's the question of whether or not it is sound, and for that we have to look at the premise. If God created the species independently, then they would have different genetic codes. First of all, this is blatantly anti-scientific, as we've just seen. It ignores these major problems we've gone over, including the fact that it ignores the gene transfer, the lateral or horizontal gene transfer that just wouldn't work if all the species had a different genetic code. It's blatantly anti-scientific to start with. Secondly, it is a counterfactual claim. We have no idea what this sort of a world would be like. We have no world where all of the species have different genetic codes. We've never built such a world. We've never designed such a world. We have one world to look at, and the species have a common genetic code. And finally, it is a religious claim, and this is the key to the argument. Everything hinges on this religious claim. If God created the species, this is how it would be. This is a religious claim, and this is from where the power of evolution comes. Evolution is a religious theory that contradicts the science.